Hello, good afternoon, good morning, for wherever you're from. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today on this webinar on strategic alignment made practical, tools that you can use immediately. My name's Lynn Hunter. I'm one of the training producers at Informa Connect Academy based in the Dubai office, and we're very pleased that you're joining us today. I just would like to introduce you to Andrew Constable. Andrew is going to be the speaker today, who will be taking you through the content of the webinar. Now, Andrew is extremely experienced in this area of strategy, business model innovations. He's got a lot of hands-on experience with a number of different organizations across the world. He has been doing his doctorate at Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland, and he is experienced in strategy, leadership, OKR, balanced scorecard, process improvements, to name just a few. So we're going to be spending the next this webinar with Andrew. So thank you, Andrew. What will happen is Andrew will take you through the content. You will see that there is the ability for you to write any questions that you might have. There's a questions and answers box or the chat box. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into there. And as we get to the end of the session, I will come back to those questions and read them out to Andrew, and he can answer any questions that you might have. The session is being recorded, so it will be shared with everybody as well. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand you over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And welcome everybody onto today's call. So, as Lynn said, a bit of my background really, so who I am. So I think just encourage people to connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a lot on LinkedIn about strategy and innovation and such like, and I'm based in the UK, as Lynn said. And I kind of work with lots of different organizations in the strategy, development, execution, and innovation field. So quite broad experience in what I'm trying to do. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to go into this thing called strategy, execution, alignment. And we're not going to talk about specifically about how you cascade objectives from the top down towards the bottom of the organization. We're going to talk about how you think about you can align the organization from some key areas we need to focus on. And we're going to use an example of an assessment that we would normally do. And then from that, we're going to give you some takeaway tools as well that you can use as we go forward. So as like Lynn said, if you've got any questions as we're going through, do keep them, put them in the chat, and then at the end we will answer them, and hopefully we can provide some value for you as we step through this. So just quickly before we actually get into the main topic, so the Balanced Scorecard Institute is a US-based company as partner of Informa, and these are some of the example customers the BSI program has worked with, and there's hundreds more that we've worked with over the years. And like I said, we very much focus on that strategic sort of planning, scenario planning, and such like as we step forward. So let's get into the main part of this topic then. And the first question we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about, can we align strategy in an organization, and what kind of elements do we need in place? The first question we need to ask ourselves is, do we actually have a strategy, or do we just have a set of goals? Because this is, again, one of the big issues with strategic planning that we see, that people just have generally objectives, okay, or aspirations. We want to be the number one in our market. We want to have this, we want to do that. They don't have a clear set of choices about where they're going to play in the market, and also how they're going to win in that market. And then what sort of systems do they need and capabilities do they need to actually deliver this strategy that they're looking to do? So that's the first thing I'd always say to you on the call is, make sure when you actually look at your strategic documents, is it just a list of objectives, or is it making clear choices which are integrated and support each other? So we need to think about, if we use the framework from Roger Martin, who's a very well-regarded strategy author, he will talk about the 5 questions. What's our win aspiration? Where are we going to play in the market? How are we going to win in that market? What capabilities we're going to need? And then lastly, what systems are we going to need? So these are things we need to think about. So that's the first thing. That's the first issue I generally see with most companies I work with, is they provide strategic planning documents, they give it to me, and it's literally just a set of goals or aspirations. So let's first of all check, do we actually have a fully integrated strategy? If we haven't, let's go back and let's devise one based on where we want to be. Other things we think about when we're thinking about strategy as well is poor strategy. If we have a very bad strategy, or we don't have a strategy, we have then poor implementation of that strategy. Okay. So for this, what usually happens is we have far too much emphasis on the planning side of things and very little on the execution. Okay, it's an afterthought sometimes. And this really stems from a lot of training that managers get in organizations, or especially in business school, where you go to business school and 80% you're taught is about formulation of strategy. It's not taught about execution of strategy. So really we have to think about how can we join these together, this formulation and execution, to just start calling it strategy, not formulation and execution. So that's the first thing I think is really important that we think about, and it's a mistake we see a lot. We also have another issue I see a lot in organizations is limited ownership and accountability. You're as a leader of an organization, you need to own that strategy. Okay, so if the CEO, you're a CEO of your organization, you need to own that strategy. Okay, it needs to be you who is driving that forward with your team, and you need to be accountable for that. Okay, and you need to communicate this in the right way. So we need to be talking about our direction we're going in, making sure people understand this and such like as we move through the organization. We also then need to think about the alignment we have between the top of the organization and the teams on the ground. So we can think about how we can cascade objectives from our strategy right down through the organization, but we also need to think about, do they actually understand our strategy in our business? Okay. If you had to ask someone on the front line of your organization, could they actually name the strategy of your organization? And this is a really important topic we need to think about, because from experience and from lots of studies done on this subject, less than 10% of frontline employees can actually name the main strategic priorities of their business, depending on the size of the company. So we need to think about that as we're developing this, as we develop our strategy moving forward. And when we think about this whole piece I just mentioned between strategic planning or formulation and execution, we need to think about this as one chain, not just individual pieces of that chain. And we need to think about how we can sort of connect all this together so it actually makes sense to the organization, and the organization actually delivers the results it needs to deliver. Because one of the things we have to think about doing is making strategy everyone's job. Okay, as Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. Okay, so when we're doing this, we need to think about all the different steps in whatever strategy process you use in your organization. But we need to find a way of connecting the front end of strategy, looking at the trends, the patterns, what's happening in the markets, what's happening in the competitive landscape, and how that can impact our strategy execution at the end. One chain in how we want to think as we move forward. And we also need to think about the different steps when it comes to alignment as well. So we really want to be thinking, traditional businesses will talk about the mission, the vision, the values at the front end. Now, it depends on how you approach strategy development. Some organizations will use this, some will use a different format, okay? And it depends on your situation. But let's think about what it looks like for the future. Then let's think about this thing called strategy though, okay? How are you going to move from A to B, okay? And what integrated choices are you going to make? We then need to think about, how does that impact with the day-to-day objectives of the business units, the support units in your organization, and then what initiatives or activities would you say are connected into that, which will help drive the strategy forward? And then lastly, we need to answer the question, how do I as an employee fit into this whole strategy process? And why does it matter that I'm involved in this going forward? So these are some of the things we need to think about when we're diving into this whole piece of alignment. And it's not just as simple as moving from the top of the organization and cascading objectives throughout the organization. We need to think about the whole piece, everything that we're thinking about in this alignment phase. this is a good slide to demonstrate, I think, this concept here. And if you look at how we connect the different elements of strategy, and again, there could be lots of different more elements, but this is an example. We think about if we have an actionable, if we have a vision, we have a strategy which is actionable, we have capabilities in place, we have the incentives for the employees, we have the right resources, and we have the right urgency from the business, generally we get success. But if we find that one of those pieces is missing, we start to notice problems. And if we look at if the vision, the direction, the North Star we're heading towards is missing, we generally have confusion. Okay, people don't know where they're heading as an organization. If we don't have a strategy in place, we just have the rest of it in place. We have this thing called false starts, where that is really about, because we haven't got a direction or a North Star, we keep chasing something new and we keep starting something and then changing and going somewhere else. And this happens all the time. And this is called, in the UK, we call this the magpie strategy, where you go and chase the next shiny object. Okay, as we're thinking about that going forward. If we don't have the capabilities in place, we can create anxiety in the organization. Okay, we've been given something we need to do as an organization to try and drive our results forward, but if we don't have those capabilities in place, it's going to create a lot of anxiety for your employees. If you have no incentives, you're going to get resistance, okay, potentially in the organization. So we need to think about how you can work with your teams and your business and HR, how you can think about building incentives into your strategy. If we have no resources, we all know it creates frustration and annoyance, and that's connected very heavily to what the capabilities are lacking in organizations. And then if we have no urgency, and this comes back to the leadership of the organization, if we have no urgency that this has got to happen quickly, and the reason why we need to change our business or why we need to change our strategy going forward, we just get empathy, okay? We just get people to think, yeah, that's really interesting, really good, but there's no urgency. I don't need to change, or we don't need to do this right this minute. And then the business will just drift. So this is why we need to start thinking about these different elements and how they can be aligned in the organization to make sure we actually can follow the top line, which is success, okay? And how that would allow you to develop your strategy into execution and into results. So let's have a look at this whole piece about strategy execution then, which is a big part of the alignment phase. And what we need to think about is, as I've said, we want to bridge the two sides. One side is that strategy formulation part where we're coming up with our strategy, our choices, we're coming up with then objectives, potentially we'll deliver in the business, and then we need to go off and execute these as we move forward. And we need to really have a bridge between the two to create one unit, okay, and how we work. And we call this the imperatives, okay, strategy execution imperatives. And they're covered by 5 different areas, which I think are really important. The first one is you need engaged leadership and governance. Okay, I'm going to talk about some of these as we go through. But we really need that in the organization. If the leadership is not engaged in the strategy process, there's a very good chance it's not going to work. Okay, so we need to have that in place. Obviously, we need to align the different business units. We need to think about how these all work together to achieve the ultimate results of the organization. We also need to think of the culture. The culture of the organization is really important. So we need to think about how we can look at culture and how we can assess culture and how we can enable culture to deliver our strategy in our organization in a better way. Also, one of the things with strategy development is a strategy formulation and execution, or this thing called strategy, is we want to make sure we're reviewing our performance as we go along. We don't want to just set something and forget about it, okay, which can be a big problem in organizations. We have to have some cadence in place where we can start reviewing our results, analyzing, learning, and this informs our next cycle of our strategy development process. So we need to start thinking about this and how we can bring this forward. And ultimately, we also need to think about projects and portfolio management, okay, because ultimately to deliver on the strategy of the organizations, we have to close gaps normally, and those gaps are normally closed by projects, okay, initiatives, another word for that you will hear. So we need to think about these main factors as we step through to create this aligned organization between one side of strategy and the other to create this one word strategy instead of separating it. So let's have a quick look at, we're going to do a quick case study on how we can apply the 5 imperatives to alignment in an organization and why it's important. And what we're going to do here, we're just going to show you an example of an organization which is made up, it's a made up organization. And we're gonna use something called basically an assessment. And from that, what it will allow us to do, it will allow us to start thinking about what are the issues and challenges that an organizations have around these different imperatives. And then how can we improve that? What could we do to improve that? And then also, is there any tools and techniques we can use to help with this going forward? So what we usually do is we usually bring something like this in, a strategy execution assessment, okay? It's based around the 5 imperatives. And as a leadership team, you would go through this and you would rank, okay, where you think you are based on the various questions, okay? And once you've done this, this will give you a good picture of where your strengths and weaknesses are in your organization. And then from that, we can then, as a team, if you were working with the BSI consultants working with you guys, we could actually then start identifying areas of improvement in your business and find ways of actually developing your strategy to go forward and to be executed in the right way. So the first thing we always do is we always bring this assessment up, okay? And you can download, if you go to the BSI's website, you can actually go and take the strategy maturity test on that, and this will generate a report for you and tell you where you're strong and where you're weak, okay, as we go forward. That's the first thing. This is how we set the stage here. We use the assessment to determine where we are. So in this example here, this organization, so when they actually answered their first questions, the first part, which is engage leadership and government, they talked about some issues and challenges that they had. Okay, so they originally said that they thought they were potentially lacking in certain areas. For example, strategy supporting functions in the organization was lacking. And what we found from this assessment was that the board and the senior leaders don't spend enough time on strategy. And this is a good test normally for organizations, is to look at the calendar for the next 3 months in your organization and see how many meetings are in the diary to discuss strategy, not business as usual operations, but how many meetings are in place to talk about strategy. Okay, you should at least have a review period in a quarter to review your strategy. But I do see a lot of organizations that don't have any time at all in the diary to develop strategy and to monitor strategy. So that's the first thing I'd seen, okay, when we did this case study. Other things as well to think about. So when we think about this thing called strategy focused leadership, okay, that was lacking in the organization. So the ultimate North Star, the vision of the organization and the objectives of the vision weren't being communicated to the rest of the business. So there was very much a disconnect between the two. And we also have seen in this trait at the bottom where we had leadership and governance shortfalls. And that was really stemmed because we had roles and responsibilities which were very unclear in this process. They didn't understand how they fitted in to the strategy process. Okay. So just from a first assessment, we kind of got a good overview of where they're struggling and where they were strong. And as you can see, there's lots of other points on here as examples, which we would use, and we would dive into this in real life. And then from this, now we've got issues and challenges, and we've identified some of the main challenges, we can start thinking about actions to help us improve the performance. And then we can start bringing some tools and various ways of working into this. So one of the things that leaders should be doing in the organization is walking the talk, okay, and communicating up and down the organization with clarity. And what we mean by that is that if the leadership team has a specific strategy in place they want to focus on, an area they want to really work towards, the leaders need to talk about that in the language which is being communicated to do with the strategy. They don't want to disconnect that. They want to constantly talk about this moving forward. And they want to allow, turn it into language which people in the organization are going to understand. Okay, so don't fill it full with business speak with loads of weasel words, as we call it. Use plain language to determine and to outline what the strategy is in your organization. Other things you could do in this place as well, you could think about how could you bring a disciplined process, not only for the strategy part, for developing your choices, but how could you then bring a disciplined process in place for goal setting, okay, objective setting, and communicating strategy in the organization? And there's lots of different processes and lots of different methods out there for objective setting, anywhere from balanced scorecard to objectives and key results and such like. Okay, so make sure we have a disciplined process in place and we follow those principles as we think about this going forward. And then some tools and techniques you could use around this. So one of the things you could actually use the strategy management maturity assessment model, which allows you to baseline where you currently are today from a maturity of strategy. And what this will allow you to do then, it will allow you to review this over time and see how you've improved as an organization. And when we do this, we use different dimensions of maturity. So we step through the different levels of strategy in an organization and we measure it to see where you would sit in that organization. So if you're a level one organization for strategy, everything is very ad hoc. Okay. You have no strategy as such, or very, very weak strategy. You have no documented processes in place. You don't review your strategy and such like. What we do is when we do the maturity model is we review your organization, or you do this yourselves in your team, and you review it by leadership, culture and values, strategic thinking and planning, your alignment in the organization, performance measurement, performance management, process improvement, and sustainability. And you go through, and as a team, you individually would do this, and then you compare the results of how you got along. This will allow you to sort of notice any blind spots between different members of your management team, but will also allow you to baseline where you actually are today. So over the next 12 months, you can actually then review this, and hopefully you'd seen an improvement in your strategy alignment in your organization and the conditions that your strategy is going to work in. So this is how we think about this. Okay, this is one of the tools you can take away. You can use this model. Again, you can use this. You can download this for free on the BSI's website. This will allow you to actually use this and plot where you are. Because the ultimate outcome we're trying to get to when we're trying to align this strategy execution piece in an organization is we want to make sure senior leadership drives and is fully involved in strategy execution. Okay, they need to be championing this. They need to be driving this as we go forward. So there you go. There's some examples of how we can think about leadership by using the maturity model and thinking about the different factors which are really important. The other thing we have to think about then, if we go to the assessment, the first thing we did when we talked about the execution assessment is we could then look at the performance culture in the organization. And if we use the case study example of the organization, when they went through and they took their assessment, they noticed that there were some shortfalls. And we talked about here, we've got example here, the change and transformation was not incorporated into strategy. Okay, so they didn't include any change management in strategy. And one of the things we need to think about when we execute strategy in an organization is that it's a change project. You know, we're making a big change potentially to the organization or certain parts of the organization, and we need to manage it like a change project. So that's the first thing we need to think about. Also, any change we do in an organization, you're going to get resistance to. So we need to think about how can we work with that. Okay, really, really important. Also, I said earlier in the call, there's a lack of incentive behaviors in this example as well. So we need to think about how can we incentivize people in the organization to drive the strategy forward. And importantly, are those incentives that you put against the strategy in your organization, is it going to drive the right behavior as we go forward? Because that's so important when we're developing our strategy and these imperatives within the organization. When we look at the communication shortfalls the organization had, the staff weren't informed or even motivated about the strategy and the goals. Okay. They had no buy-in, there was no communication in the right way, and people felt it was just given to them. And also, the need for change wasn't communicated. So they didn't understand why something was changing. They just heard about it, and that created whispers around the organization, rumors, and obviously anxiety and stress. So that was some of the examples that we shown when we were actually developing this. And then we thought about, okay, how can we then, what actions could we actually do within the organization, and what tools and techniques could we use again? So the first thing you can do, obviously, is identify the change agents in your organization. Think about the people who are going to execute the strategy. Think about the people who are very good at executing change in the organization. Do you have specific roles in your organization who are very experienced in this area, who can support and help you in delivering your change in your organization? Do you have to go out and potentially find people? Do you go and work with partners to do this? Do you upskill people? But think about that. Think about who's the change agents in your organization. Really, really important. We also need to think about in the performance culture as well. We need to make sure that we actually understand the values and the beliefs of the staff. Okay, so really we want to do an assessment before we even implement the strategy to understand, okay, what's our values of our team, but also what's important to the employees in the organization. Okay, and does that work with the strategy that you're trying to deliver? So we need to do that as well. So these are some things we can think about improving. There's a lot more on there that we could talk about, but I just want to pull out a few of these different areas. Some tools and techniques you can use as well to do this. There's lots of change management and cultural management is a huge subject. Okay, huge subject. But we need to think about these different tools that we could use. So one of the things we could actually do is we could actually run something called a cultural competency self-assessment. And this is where the organization would review themselves, again, similar to the leadership assessment I showed you a minute ago. And they review and say, okay, where are they sitting from now, from a cultural perspective? And where do they need to go in the future? And how could they actually improve? And what you can show is you can use something like this, okay? And there's lots of different examples of culture assessments out there. But we're really thinking about different elements that we have to think about from accountability, from growth, from teamwork, from mentorship, from training, everything else. And then we can move it between where we are today and where we are in the future. So have a look online for tools like this. Think about how you can bring in cultural self-assessments as an organization to really help you drive and understand your strategy, your culture and your organization to enable your strategy to develop. So again, it's another takeaway tool you can use. Again, you can find lots of these tools online as we're going forward to help you with this sort of alignment of these imperatives in your organization. Because ultimately, again, what we're trying to get to, we're trying to help the organization's employees find greater purpose, build continuous improvement mindsets, and create dedication to what the purpose of the organization is, okay, the mission of the organization. Because it's been proven that if an employee is very well connected to the ultimate mission, the purpose of the organization, that organization is a higher performing organization compared to ones which are disconnected. So we need to take that in consideration when we're building out our strategy, thinking about what culture is the strategy going to work in, okay, and work with. So important to think about that as we move forward. Okay, so that was the first two imperatives of the alignment we think about. Leadership and governance is one part. Okay, do you have the right buy-in? Are you driving the right messages? Are you walking the talk? You can use the maturity model to help you assess where you are today, and this will allow you to drive forward. We also talked about the performance culture, why culture is so important. We need to think about a way of baselining where we are today by using something like the tool I've just shown you a second ago, where you can measure where you are today to where you want to be in the future, which helps you understand your employees, which helps them hopefully be more connected to the organization. So let's move on to the third part then, the third part of the assessment we run. And this is about how how aligned and operationalized the strategy is in an organization. And if we look at some of the issues and challenges what came up when we were doing this, I think one of the issues that we tend to see a lot is that the operating units or the divisions, you want to call them, the functions, whatever you want to call them, they create their own plans independently, okay, without having any connection to the wider company strategy, okay. And what that happens is when you do that is you have lots of different directions the organization's going in. So we really need to have a very clear strategy at an organization level. And then the departments below that need to look at that strategy and say, how do we contribute to this going forward? And how aligned are we? So that's the first thing we see, very little guidance to the operating units and the functions about how they actually go off it and develop their strategy for what they're doing. And this does lead to this whole piece called islands or islands of activity. Okay. And that's really the question that people ask themselves is how do I fit into this? Okay. How does my team, my department, how does it fit into the wider organization? And are we aligned as an organization? So we need to think about that, aligning people and process on this. There's also everything is silo based as well. So we notice that there's a lot of silos, i.e., finance only works with finance, sales only works with sales, and such like. There's very little cross-unit coordination between the different areas. So again, really important that we think about this and think about how can we potentially break some of these silos down and increase this cross-unit collaboration between the teams. And then lastly, the last thing we see on this when we did the assessment is there was no prioritization of projects to connect it to the strategy. It was almost like a big list of projects were ongoing in the business, but very little were connected to the actual strategy of the organization. Okay, they were very much focused around pet projects, as you call them, or projects people just felt they should do that was not connected to the wider part of the organization. So again, these are some of the issues and challenges that we saw when we were doing this. And again, we need to think about some ways we could improve this. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to make sure that we involve in any strategy process in the organization. We need to make sure we're involving right from the start, finance and operations. Okay. We don't want to develop everything and then pass it over to those guys. We want to actually work together right from the start so people are aware of what's happening and why it's happening in the organization. They have their say and they can help craft the strategy going forward. Because these inputs then go into the operating plans and the budgets of the organization. So we need to think about that's the first thing we need to think about when we're doing this. The other thing is we need to build the buy-in for results for the employees. So again, this is very much about how can we actually get that buy-in from the teams on the ground and in their departments, and how they ask the question of how do we contribute to the wider organizational strategy? Because that will create alignment from the top down to the shop floor. Because strategy may be formulated at the top level of an organization, but strategy is actually executed on the ground floor of an organization. Okay, so if we don't have a connection there, we are going to struggle to deliver the results we want to. So let's think about that. Let's think about how we can actually build and bring in our employees into this process as we're going forward. Again, lots of different tools you can use here, okay? You can use different tools, you can use different methods to do things, you can bring different training in, you can bring things like whole methods like Six Sigma and such like to look at ways of improving process in an organization. But one of the things you can also think about doing is just using a simple alignment checklist, okay? And then for this, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to actually go through all the main elements of our strategy and we are asking ourselves questions. So if we see on the left hand side, we see various parts. So we'll say, for example, strategic objectives halfway down the page. And the comment we have to ask ourselves is, are strategic objectives at the right altitude? What we mean by that is, are they too high level, i.e. connected to the vision right at the top of the organization, or are they too granular? Are they more likely projects and not objectives? And then what we need to think about is writing in the right language, which is going to communicate with the teams correctly so they can then understand and communicate strategy. These are just some of the examples. This is a whole spreadsheet. Again, you can download this and it will literally give you areas you can actually go through and tick off and some questions you should be asking in your organization when you're aligning your strategy in your business, okay? Or at least setting up the alignment in your organization. So again, lots of different things here, but again, it's very much about dialogue. It's about asking questions. It's about getting people on board. This is what we think about when it comes to alignment. Okay, we need to make sure people understand what's going on, why it's happening, telling a good story, and getting people on the bus, as we say, and on that journey. Because again, the desired outcome of this is very much about the business and support unit support strategy with the coordinating activities and processes. And they also have budgets and engaged employees in place. And I think one of the things we need to think about as well when we're doing alignment is we really want to make sure that we are determining in our business units or our functions our objectives we're going to focus on. And then the support units would then develop their own objectives because they will have to do that afterwards because they need to connect to the business units to see, okay, what are the priorities of the business units and how best can we support those? So again, think about this, okay, when you're operationalizing strategy, really important, and engage finance and operations right at the start and do not leave it to the end and pass it on to them. They need to be part of this process right from day one. And then when we talked about the last part, which is the strategic project portfolio management, when we did the assessment with the organization, there was some very clear issues and challenges were coming out. So one of the things they were thinking about was there was lack of alignment and no distinction between strategic and operational projects in the business. So we need to think about that. Are they actually strategic? Are they actually impacting the whole organization? Or are they very much smaller projects within certain functions, which are only really focused on that function, but not focused on the wider strategic level project? So that's something we need to think about when we're doing this. There was also a complete lack of procedures in place for project management in the organization. And some organizations are fantastic at managing projects, really, really good at them, but others are very weak at this. So we need to make sure that we have those policies and procedures in place, which allows for things like scope creep not to happen in the organization and other projects to take place which aren't connected to what we're trying to do. So that's a very much a governance thing we need to think about. So important we think about this. We also think about the portfolio management as well. We have too many projects in the business and not enough resources. Okay, we're spreading ourselves too thin. Okay, this was an issue here for this organization, but it's also an issue across lots of organizations. And again, that's really important that we take a balanced view of our initiatives in the business. We take an audit of what we're currently doing, and we ask ourselves a simple question: are they contributing to the wider strategy of the organization or aren't they? Okay, if they're not, the business has to make a decision. Are they still important? Do we still need to continue with this? And really, the last part on this slide was all about that project management competency was lacking. So there wasn't the right skills and resources in the organizations to do a good job. So again, that's something which again can happen a lot in businesses. We need to make sure we give people the right skills and the right resource to do what they need to do. And also, lastly, the organization in this case had very little faith in the completion projections. So what I mean by that is someone would say something's going to be finished by a certain date. They didn't trust it at all. So we need to have that discipline in the organization and the trust that what we're saying is true. So some actions you can think about to improve your project and portfolio management is you could have an appropriate structure in place in your organization. So most organizations will have a project management office in place. But you can also have something called a strategy management office. And a strategy management office doesn't have to be a very big office. It could be, a couple of thousand employees in the organization, probably will have less than 10 employees of the strategy management office. And their job is really to sort of think about overseeing the process of strategy in the organization, helping and guiding the teams with their strategy development, making sure things are aligned in the organization, make sure that the right procedures are taking place, and this, that, and the other. And some parts of the world are very mature in this, like Saudi Arabia and such like has a lot of skill and expertise around the strategy management office. So something you could do, okay? But as bare minimum, you really want a project management office in place to actually manage these projects going forward. You also want to make sure you're creating visibility as well, okay, in the organization, and you're also having strong governance around this portfolio of projects, okay, because if you have visibility in the organization of what's actually happening or what projects are happening, you're going to prevent silos happening in the organization, or you're at least going to help mitigate those silos. Not going to get rid of them completely, but you're going to mitigate silos in the organization. So again, there's lots more on here, lots more different things you could talk about, but there were some ones I just picked out. Again, some tools you can use as we're going forward on here. You can use various change management principles, okay? You could use very much around templates and charters, roles and responsibilities matrices. You could do project scoring and different criterias to determine what is an important project and what is not. And again, how you rank a project in your business depends on what is important to your organization. Some will rank it via cost against benefit or impact. Others might do some other different criteria. Again, you need to think about this and what works for your organization. But again, we need to have alignment on this as we're developing it. And if you just think a simple project charter can really start taking out a lot of the noise and a lot of the miscommunication in what is actually happening in the organization and why we're actually doing what we're doing. So if you look at this example here, which is quite a basic example for people in the project management world, but it's just to give you an overview of what we're thinking about. And we start off with a justification. Why are we saying that this strategic project should take place? What's the description? What's our requirements to stop with scope creep as we go forward? Importantly, what are the high-level risks that we potentially have, and how do we connect this to risk management within the organization, which is a big part of strategy, and we need to think about that. What budget do we need? Who's the key stakeholders in the organization? And can we map those stakeholders to understand how we're going to communicate to them going forward? And importantly, what are the benefits that we think about as well? So again, think about aligning project management, aligning how you're going to manage the strategic initiatives and projects in the organization to deliver your strategy going forward. Because again, the outcome is about producing the desired benefits, okay? Making you much more strategy focused and actually being better at managing your resources in your organization, because organizations don't have a finite number of funds, they have, and time and effort. You have to balance what you're going to do in your organization, and you're going to have to focus on what is important to deliver the results that you want. Okay, so that's the strategy and project management part of this. And then we also think about, lastly on this, we think about another imperative, which is all to do with performance information, reporting, and analysis. And again, this is all about thinking about, okay, once we've set our strategy and we started implementing it, we need to think about how we're managing it, how we're measuring it, how we know we're learning from this, how do you know it's working is a question we need to ask ourselves. And some of the challenges and issues that we did see when we were doing this case study example again was KPIs weren't linked to the organization objectives. Okay, that was one thing we noticed. There was not a clear link between the KPIs, the strategic measures, and the objectives of the organization. So again, that's a problem you need to think about. We also need to think about the data and how it's been interpreted in the organization. So we need to be very clear about how we're thinking about how we're going to collect the data, what does it mean, sorry, the data, where we're getting it from, when we're going to collect it. These are things we need to think about as we're going forward. Also, when we think about reporting performance, and this example, this organization found that the performance reporting wasn't taken seriously. It was something which was done when there was time. There wasn't scheduled time in the diary to actually review this. It was very ad hoc in how they actually went and found the information. And once it was sent to the various stakeholders who asked for the information, there was very little comeback on the questions about the performance, which basically meant there was no buy-in in the organization from a performance reporting perspective. And again, some organizations are fantastic at managing performance. Okay, they're brilliant at it. Others are very weak. And it goes back to that first few slides I shown you, where we looked at that maturity model of an organization and we reviewed it from level 1 ad hoc right to level 5, which was the best performing. So you need to think about where you are on that scale. And then other things we thought about as well when we were doing this as well, we thought about the performance interpretation was lacking because performance is being gamed, as we call it in the organization. So people are finding ways around trying to get to the result, the performance result, which is needed in the organization. So that could be taking shortcuts, it could be cheating in the organization, it could be lots of different things we have to think about. So there's a very good technique you can think about when you're developing measures for KPIs in your business, is ask the question, what is the silliest way someone could still achieve this result in my department or my business? And think about that, okay? And once you've come up with all the ways that they could game the system, then think about going back to it and reviewing how you can mitigate this and develop it, okay? And we call that black hat and white hat testing when we think about performance. And also, performance information is used to punish, okay, a lot in organizations. But really, performance information should be there to manage performance, but it should also be there to learn as well. We need to learn about what's working and what is not working in our organization. And then some things we can think about when it comes to improving performance. So let's think about what the first question we need to ask ourselves when we start developing measures and we start thinking about reviewing performance is, what are we trying to actually measure and what are we trying to accomplish? Okay, and that should be taken from your strategy and what you're trying to develop in your business. Once we know our direction of our organization and our results, we can start thinking about how can we measure it and how are we going to accomplish this. Also, think about incorporating feedback as well into your strategy planning process. So think about having at least once a year where we have a formal strategy refresh, where we start looking at what's going on in the world, what's going on with the macro and the micro environment, but importantly, what's our results been over the last 12 months? How have we performed? Is our strategy working? If it's not working, do we need to make a course correction? Do we need to find ways of actually changing our scope as we go forward to achieve the result we need to get to? Okay. But I think when we talked about this whole review of strategy once a year, we need to make sure that we are giving our strategy enough time to actually achieve the results it wants to. We don't want to actually just change our strategy for the sake of it. So again, you can think about different tools, okay, different ways of reviewing performance information and analyzing it. And you could actually use a process like this one on the screen, which is the measure, perform, review, adapt framework. And what you do with this is you kind of think about on the left-hand side, you think about your objectives and the results that you actually want to get to. And then you start developing your performance measures during the strategy process. And you make sure that you are defining the right measure for the objective in your strategy. Then you document that. Then we go around the wheel. We think about the targets and the thresholds we're going to try and reach. We then think about when we get to the turquoise color, we think about how we're going to collect and how we're going to visualize our data and our performance. We then think about how we're going to analyze and draw conclusions from this. And then we go into the adapt side of things where we report and we share, and importantly, we learn. And then we keep doing that over our period, okay, of what we're working on. And again, you can start reviewing things like this you can do a process of reviewing performance monthly basis. Some organizations do it bi-weekly, which is very, very rare, to be fair. Most organizations are reviewing their performance monthly, but a lot of organizations will also review it quarterly. What we have to think about then when we review performance is that the more times we review it for the year, the more chance we have to learn. So if we only review our strategy twice a year, we can only learn at that pace twice a year. We review our strategy once a month, that's 12 times in a year, we can actually learn about what's working and what not is working in our business. So these are some of the things we've got to think about when we're building out our aligned strategy. These are our key principles we need to think about right from the start, right through this whole process. Because ultimately, the performance information reporting step is all about learning, okay? It's about informing our decision making going forward based on true, real evidence of what we are trying to do. So just some best practices, and then I'm going to finish off with just an overview of the initiatives again, or the imperatives. Let's think about how we can visualize our strategy, okay? Remember, strategy development should be also about communication. So how can we make our strategy come alive in our organization? How can we make it simple to understand, which helps us communicate strategy with better clarity of what we're trying to do? Think about your criteria for prioritizing projects as well, really important. And align the organization around the strategy. Think about how the employees, the processes, the technology are fitting together, and are they driving the right behaviors? Really important. And then lastly, don't forget about rewarding performance in the organization. So if people are doing the right thing, departments are working in the right way, why not building some sort of performance reward into that? It could be an intrinsic reward, or it could be an extrinsic reward. It doesn't really, it depends on how you want to do this, because not everyone is motivated by money, for example. There's other things people may be motivated by. So think about this when you're building this out. So lastly, just to wrap up for me then, the imperatives we need to think about. We need to think about the different areas. We need to stop thinking about strategy formulation and strategy execution. We need to thinking about one thing, okay, strategy and how that fits together. We need to think about the imperatives that make up strategy. So things like your culture, things like your alignment, things like your leadership, really, really important as we go forward. And we also need to think about things like performance reviews, and importantly, which projects are going to help you get the results in your organization. So that was everything for me today. So I'm just going to bring the questions on the screen, and if Lynn's there, I'll take some questions.
Hi. Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. So thank you for that, Andrew. That was really insightful. We have got a few questions. I'll get through as many of them as I possibly can. We do have a question from Bilal, who says, is observation important and required for determining the organisation's baseline in terms of strategy and balanced scorecard settings? Or is it a step that can be skipped and won't add a value to the strategy success?
I think it depends on what we mean by observation. I think it depends on what we mean by that. I mean, so if we mean observation as in baselining where we currently are today, as an example, then you need to kind of know where you are today so you can actually start measuring it going forward. So I think if that's what you mean about baselining current performance, then I think it's something you shouldn't skip at all, because you kind of need to know where you are today before you can start developing strategy for the future, where you want to go, and then how you can baseline performance.
Thank you. I have Shaheen who asks, what KPIs or tools are recommended for aligning HR functions like training, engagement, and performance reviews with organizational strategy?
Yeah, so you need to, I mean, the first thing you need to do is you need to use tools to break down processes and such like, and identify certain measures in certain processes. So think about there's different tools you can use out there to start thinking about breaking down a process, for example, a HR process. How could you break that down using tools like process mapping, logic model is one you could use. And then from that, once you've identified all the different steps, you can then start thinking about the different measures you can bring in, the KPIs you can bring in, and how they then contribute to the wider strategy of the organization. So it's about breaking it down really as we go forward.
Perfect. And then Banda has asked, what is the best way of cascading the balanced scorecard all the way down to individual staff?
So again, there's lots of different ways of doing it. How the Balanced Scorecard Institute talks about it is we talk about it from moving from a tier one, where tier one is the top level of the organization. Okay, so the corporate scorecard, down to a tier two, which is a department of functions or departments or geographical cascading. And then we go down to a tier three, which is very much employee based. And it's all should be really what you should be thinking about is, for example, if you're working in the function below the corporate scorecard, you should be looking at the corporate scorecard above you and asking the question, how do we contribute to the company strategy? And which objectives are we going to contribute to? For example, HR probably wouldn't contribute to a sales-based revenue growth objective on the company scorecard, so they would contribute something else. And we look at objectives by determining, are we going to keep the same language, i.e. cascade it straight down? Are we going to amend the language that was used in our objectives? Are we going to add our own objectives? Or are we going to remove some of the objectives from the corporate to our company scorecard? But again, it's a big topic, alignment. We do cover it in a lot of all our courses. It's something it's really important. We spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah. I have one here, somebody anonymous is asking, and I think this might be quite a, there might be a lot of ifs and buts around this, but what is a realistic timeline to see improvements when using the tools in a mid-sized company?
So I mean, yeah, it depends. It depends on what type of organization. I mean, to see a result, you should be able to see an improvement in your performance in an organization if you follow the right process, as in making sure you've got strategy in place, making sure you've got clear objectives, and you're reviewing those objectives on a predetermined basis, i.e., every month. You should be able to see an improvement in your performance and cohesion of a team. I would suggest in at least a quarter. You should see in 1 quarter, at least some starting points. It's not going to be perfect by no means, but you're going to see it. Normally with the balance, if we take the balanced scorecard as an example, to fully institutionalize a balanced scorecard organization, you're talking about 2 to 3 years before it would really get into place. But that is a big organization. That's not necessarily a smaller, mid-sized company. So it could be a lot quicker than that. But you'll see results you should see the results in the first quarter of at least an improvement in people's understanding, how they're reviewing things. But again, it takes time, effort, and management to do this.
Yeah. Okay. There are a few more questions. I'm just going to ask one more, just in the interest of time. I'm just going to ask one more. Jerry Shom's got about 3 or 4 questions. I'll just go to one of them at the moment. How can a small team or department achieve strategic alignment, even if the larger organization's goals aren't clearly defined?
Yes, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. I think you sometimes have to go back to the wider organization and you have to really try and investigate, what these objectives mean at a company level to try and get a bit more understanding behind that. So if there's an objective like improved profitability, well, what does that actually mean? You would need to go back and find people in the organization who come up with this and say, look, can you just talk me through what this means? What does improved profitability mean? Okay, it may sound obvious, but it probably isn't. And try to do some digging in the organization and trying to find out. And then once you've got a good understanding, or at least understanding the context behind why they've come up with their strategy and their objectives, then you can go off and you can develop your own and ask, is our objectives we are developing, are they aligned with what our understanding of strategy actually is in the wider organization?
Yeah.
That's how I would suggest it. It's problem solving.
Okay. There's a few more questions, but what I think might be a good idea, as I say, just interest of time, people might need to leave, is maybe if we can hear it in Informa Connect Academy, we can pull all the questions and maybe ask them directly to Andrew, and then maybe send the questions and answers out to everybody. That might be the best plan. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. If you're interested in hearing more from Andrew, Andrew actually delivers a number of training programs with us here at Informa Connect Academy, and we have a very long-standing relationship with Balanced Scorecard. So you can see here, these are just some of the courses that Andrew himself is going to be delivering just in this year alone. So he is certified in all of these topics. So if you're interested in any of these, then please reach out to us. I think the next slide has a QR code that you can scan if you want to find out a little bit more about those particular training programs, and see if you want to register for any of those courses. We also have, Andrew's also going to be involved in the Saudi Strategy Week, which we have in Riyadh between the 28th of September and 2nd of October. So again, if that's something you're interested in, please reach out to us. We have a conference day where we have a number of experts who are going to be discussing strategy, and we have a number of workshops that are happening as well. And then finally, your learning doesn't stop just with our webinars and our training courses. There's lots of content that we create and put onto our LinkedIn profile. So if you want to have a look at our LinkedIn profile, then again, here you can scan this particular code, and that will take you to the to our LinkedIn page. But thank you everybody very much for attending. As I say, we will be sharing the recording with everybody. It will be posted on our socials as well. Andrew, thank you very much. That was really insightful, some great context there. So thank you very much for delivering that. That was really good. We appreciate your time. And thank you everybody for joining us.
What if you and your team can be even more informed, competitive, accomplished, even more successful, with programs designed to inspire and empower everyone to become even more? Introducing Informa Connect Academy. With hundreds of global, digital, and in-person training courses led by world-renowned industry experts, reimagining learning experiences for even more unlocked potential. Informa Connect Academy, available at informaconnect.com/academy.